Restoring old steam toys, a small brass traction engine, part 1. What is it? Why does it belong to me? Where did it come from? And what is wrong with it? I'll start at the beginning. What is it? It's a small brass traction engine given to me by a man called Roy Haynes, who had an engineering company in Leeds many years ago. Roy gave me this traction engine as a box of bits. It was all that was left over from a production run that he had made of executive toys for business executives. Roy was a friend of a friend. I'd bought an old South Bend lathe from a local model shop, and it was absolutely worn out. The model shop owner didn't believe me, and he was just trying it on, so I asked Roy to come down to my workshop as an expert and tell him what was wrong with it. At first the owner of the model shop was reluctant to refund me, but after we kept him prisoner for 2 hours, he gave in. I then went on to buy this from Roy. It's a Holbrook Model B No. 9 lathe. At the time I bought it, it was very old, and it was very good. I wish I still had it. I actually sold it to a friend of mine, and I think he probably still uses it. I also bought a thing called a jig borer, which is like a milling machine, from Roy. And both of these machine tools ended up in my new workshop, which was in the cellar of the first house that I bought. I remember it was really good fun installing these machines, but less so when a few years later I sold them. Getting these machines up the cellar steps was a very memorable occasion. I assembled this traction engine, and it sat on a shelf in my first house for quite a while, and another shelf in my second house, and finally on the top of an old mechanical arcade game that I used to have screwed to the wall. I haven't looked at this for many years. It sat on the shelves next to a Birmingham dribbler that I rebuilt a few months ago. I didn't like that very much and gave it to my friend James Evans. I like this model for a variety of reasons. My regard for Roy Haynes was very high. The man was a genius engineer. When I was 27, Roy Haynes was possibly in his 50s or 60s, I can't remember. I visited him on various occasions, and he sort of took me under his wing and showed me some tricks of the trade. I spoke to him about twist drill sharpening jigs, and he just pooh-poohed it and said, "No, you do it like this," and proceeded to show me how to sharpen drills. I'm a bit concerned about the state of this engine. How did it get so badly damaged? There's a big dent on the chimney, and the cylinder's definitely not in the right position, and the rear wheels are bent. The old arcade game was screwed to the wall fairly high up, and the state of this engine leads me to believe that it was knocked off the arcade game and fell on the floor, and to make things worse, the floor was made of solid oak. Here's the damage in detail. The cylinder is definitely not aligned with the port face anymore. I'll move a few of the many spider webs so you can see it in detail. The wheel castings are beautiful, and the engineering standard, which is manual, is outstanding. Remember, there was no CNC in those days. No internet, and not even any computers. I think I got my first computer in about 1987, if I remember rightly. This engine is just a steam toy, and it's very simple, and the design is really good. Unlike a Mamod, or a Maymod as some people pronounce it, it does not have an axle that goes through the fire. I never did think that was a good idea. Remember though, this engine was not really mass-produced. It was part of a production run, which is very different to the thousands and thousands of Mamod engines circulating in the world still. I think it's time to get on with the job and take it apart. When I look at this small traction engine, I'm very impressed by the way it's made. For instance, look at the detail on the end of the piston rod. And it's fully serviceable. The crank pin screws into the crank web, so you could remove it and make another one if this first one wore out. As usual, I've selected a plastic box to put the parts in. Here's the flywheel. I'm having a look at the way that the piston doesn't align with the port. This means that the impact when the engine hit the floor was on the flywheel, followed by the back wheels and finally the chimney. It's a very clever design. The main bearing is pressed into the block. Maybe if I tap it gently with a hammer and a piece of wood, it may return to where it's supposed to be, but alas, that didn't work. So it's time to go further and unscrew the crank pin. Here it is. I'll put it in the box so I don't lose it. I always use a plastic box like this for the parts because often I have several things going on at one time. Suddenly I had a brainwave, which wasn't a good brainwave. I thought I'll use some WD-40 to lubricate the bearing where it's pressed into the block, and then re-tap it with the hammer, which I did, all to no avail. This is proper engineering. The bearing is pressed into the central block, and as I would have expected from Roy, it's a perfect interference fit. When I first assembled this engine, I did run it. I put a fuel pellet in the firebox and filled it with water. I just put a small cork in the safety valve hole because I never got a safety valve with it. Have a close look at this image. Yes, I know the engine's dirty. I'm going to clean that up shortly. Can you see how the boiler bands have been formed? The shell of the boiler is quite thick, and the boiler bands have just been made using a parting tool. They're not really boiler bands, they're sort of boiler band depressions. I'm going to make a safety valve for this. I'm not going to fit a Mammoth safety valve. I'll make my own. I don't know what the original safety valve looked like because there wasn't one in the box of bits. I'll do a bit of Googling and see whether I can find a photograph of one of these engines complete. Periodically they do come up on eBay. Once again, as I've just mentioned, I really do like the way it has boiler bands cut into the boiler. It just makes it look better. The smoke box was always loose. When I first fitted it, there was a bit of a problem. I can't remember why, but I know I couldn't tighten it up and I didn't want to try and shear off the bolts. Here, using a socket, I'm removing the two bolts in the smoke box that hold it to the boiler itself. They weren't tight and they came loose very easily. This is what I found inside. Now I get how the design works. All I need to do is fit some washers between the two bolts that hold this to the boiler. Fitted of course under the bolt heads. Then once I tighten the part to the boiler, the smoke box will be a tight fit against the boiler. Then the front axle and the chimney won't wobble about. At the lower end of the chimney there is a part that is spring-loaded, and I think there must be a bit missing that fits on the axle to stop it wobbling from side to side. As far as I can tell, the chimney is pushed onto this part just with some kind of sealant. I applied some 3-in-1 oil in an attempt to get it loose. I can't use pliers on this. By carefully working it back and forth, eventually it let go. I really do like this little traction engine. That's why I didn't give it to anybody. I'm keeping this one. When I pull the bottom part, the spring-loaded assembly has a plunger that goes through the bottom part near the axle. I think I'll fit a piece of shaped brass to this so it stays in place, looks the part and does the job. Time now to remove the main bearing block that the crankshaft goes through. Once this part was unbolted, the holes can be clearly seen to go quite a way down into the boiler shell, which is quite thick. One of the main wheels has a bent axle, and in this clip I'm attempting to straighten it. A bit of a cautionary note here, you have to have had plenty of practice at doing this sort of thing. I'm using a firm but gentle approach, and in no time at all the axle's looking better. As I mentioned earlier, unlike a Mammoth, the axle doesn't go all the way through the fire, which I always thought was a mad idea. This engine has fittings, and the axles are stub axles that bolt through into the firebox but don't go all the way through. Once I oiled the piston and the port block, it feels very smooth indeed. I will be taking the wheels off, but not just yet. There are quite a few things left to do. Straightening the flange on the top of the chimney will be quite good fun. That's it for now though. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.